Spooky. It is Tuesday night, and um, I'm a little late. I was putting my person person with autism to bed, rather unsuccessfully. But anyway, he's quiet. And tonight we are going to be talking about Camp Mystic. Yesterday, as many of you may know, some lawsuits were filed, and we learned, I think it was about 30 pages. I've read through it 2 or 3 times. A lot of the information in there was known, but there was some new details too, I thought. Now, the Eastlands had a statement, and their attorney said, this is not all substantiated. So we'll look forward to our chance in court to argue against what's being said. And people love Camp Mystic. I mean, they think it's wonderful. I would argue that these families that sent their daughters to Camp Mystic who never came home, they also love Camp Mystic. And maybe their perspective feels a little different because they didn't get to pick up their campers. For me, I'm going to just tell you a little side note story while people are jumping on. My husband and I went out of town this weekend and left our caregiver here with our youngest son, Amos, who turned 12 on Sunday. And we had a fire in our house. And we had a lightning strike, and our nanny heard beeping, and the power had gone off, so she went back to sleep. And the dog, our service dog, who was not trained for fire, whined and cried until she got up, and she went upstairs and smelled what she thought smelled like sulfur and smelled like smoke. It called the fire department, and there was a fire. So today, I've had different work people in the house, and the electrician cut these 2 wires out that have to be replaced. And he said, do you want these? And at the time I said, well, yeah, I've got the insurance person coming and I want her to see them. But then I was like, just looking at them and thinking, like, these represent a lot more than what could have been. And I think about what would have happened if the service dog didn't wake Mary up, or Mary slept through it and Amos died in this fire. I think what people would have said is, well, what I would have said is, what about it was my fault, And you would have said, did you have fire alarms? And I would have said, yeah, we had fire alarms. And you would have said, did you, I don't know what else we could have done. Now I think, well, shoot, now I'm going to have the alarm system hooked up so that it would call the fire department. We had a caregiver here in charge of Amos, But in 1 second, tragedy strikes. And I think our instinct, in a good way, is to say, what happened? What could have happened? What could we have done differently? What happened? And I think what's been happening to me with Camp Mystic, where my glasses are, oh, you're there. I'm at this age where I can't see with them and I can't see without them. So it's just a pain. What is interesting is that people feel very uncomfortable with going down this road of what happened, what could have happened differently. And unfortunately, to me, if you looked at these wires and you said, the first basic question you would say is, did you have fire alarms in your house? And I would say yes. Well, what if I said no? And for Camp Mystic, the question would be, what was your flood evacuation plan? And the flood evacuation plan was this. And some of this is going to be hard to hear. And these are not dramatic facts. These are not, I'm not saying things to get clicks. I'm just saying absolute truth. And the truth is not something that people really like because they feel vulnerable. Here's what the flood plan said. All cabins are constructed on high, safe locations. All cabins are constructed on high, safe locations. And then it went on to say, do not leave your cabin. Do not leave your cabin. Yeah, it's not true. The cabins weren't on high locations. They were not. So you can't lie, right? I can't say, don't worry if there's a fire. We have sprinklers. And you're like, well, they have sprinklers. They did not have sprinklers. I do not have sprinklers. No sprinklers. Right? So in this case, in the flood plan, it says all cabins are on high, safe locations. It wasn't true. It wasn't true. It was in not only a floodplain, but I'll show you where it was. Bubble Inn was in the 100-year floodplain, and Twins 1 and 2 was in the FEMA floodway. If you're frozen or you can't hear, go out and come back in. So anyway, this lawsuit was filed yesterday, and I was like thinking, how are we going to talk about this? And we're going to start with a story that I've never told, that was actually shared in People magazine in July. And Ainsley Bashara, 19-year-old counselor at a cabin that you really haven't heard probably a lot about, and it was called Gigglebox. So there were several cabins that were in this really low area, or they call it the flats. Wiggle Inn, Bubble Inn, Twins 1 and 2, Nut House. I know nothing about Nut House. Chatterbox, Bug House, and Gigglebox. So Gigglebox is what we're about to tell a story about now. These cabins are all very close together. Ainsley is this counselor at Gigglebox, and actually this was in the Washington Post. That night, she's in her cabin with her 2 younger counselors. They had campers ages 8 to 10. The rain was picking up on the evening. They were worried by July 4th early morning, around 2 a.m., she heard yelling from another cabin. She saw older campers from a bunk built on lower ground running to higher ground with their blankets and pillows. This is at 2 a.m. A camp staffer came by their cabin. We don't know who this is, but in the lawsuit, it does talk about an Eastland. A camp staffer told the campers and counselors, including Ainsley, in Gigglebox, stay put. Only campers closest to the river need to evacuate. Stay put, these girls were told. So she and her co-counselors They did what they were told. This is around 2 a.m. They stayed put. They had the campers put on their shoes and their raincoats. They put their belongings on the highest bunks. They put the trunks against the front door because the water began to seep under the crack. And Ainsley had a light that her dad had given her. And she looked out the window and she saw a foot of water. And she said, okay, we're going to go out. This is at 3 a.m. 3 a.m. How many campers were in each cabin? I think it depended, but in Gigglebox, there were 16. So there was a counselor, 2 younger counselors, and 16 campers, ages 8 to 10. She's told by a staff member, stay in your cabin at 2 a.m. At 3 a.m., she says, essentially, we're getting the hell out of here. She went through the window, stepped into this cold rushing water. Her co-counselors, who had just graduated from high school, helped each child out the window to Ainsley. Then Ainsley guided them through the water in these small groups, getting them to the dry pavilion, which was 30 feet away. And I think that's one thing that came out in the lawsuit that I found really interesting. Very close from Bubble Inn, Twins 1 and 2, where children died. It was a 60-second run, fast walk to get to safety. We're not talking like, you got to get up to the top of Everest to be safe. Very quick space. So from 2 in the morning to 3 in the morning, it wouldn't have been hard. Ainsley said she remembers saying it's going to be okay to all of her campers. They were all crying. When she had 16 of her campers and her co-counselors accounted for, she said they heard campers from another cabin, that housed some of the camp's youngest children, begging for help. But at that point, there was a river of water between the pavilion and the other campers. The sounds are just horrific, and you can't do anything, she told the outlet. Meanwhile, the water was rising in the pavilion, so they moved again. They moved again. And one thing we know, well, I just think that's an important story because, I'm sorry, I have a crazy kitten in this house. You have a child, a counselor, that is able to make a decision, goes against what adults tell her to do, and she saves a cabin full of children. And I don't say that at all. There is no blame to be had on counselors. For the counselors that did what they were told, they did what they were told. This was a job. They had adults that were speaking to them who they trusted to give them good information. If I have a house full of teenagers and I tell them to do something, my assumption is they generally are going to listen to me, right? Because ultimately, it's my job to be in charge of them, especially when we're taking care of small children. So this lawsuit, we're going to read a little bit about this lawsuit. The lawsuit, I really like, has a picture of each child and a picture of each family that they are suing, the camp, and who they're suing, and they're kind of giving the background. And one thing I really thought was interesting, did they pay a lot? Yeah, I think it was about $7,500 or $8,000 for 4 weeks. So they roughly took in 12 to 14 million last summer. Now they did, after camp was over, this might freak you out, but they sent refund checks to all the families. And the refund checks, so I'm going to read you an email I got from a camper, a former camper. It's astounding how loyal the Lums are to Mystic. It feels like a bizarre cult that I've escaped, and I'm watching it from the outside. I don't know how the 4 counselors of the Twins 1 and Twins 2 cabin escaped. Half of the girls in each of those cabins survived. Perhaps sheer luck. My friend who grew up with the wife of one of the Eastland men has received no communication beyond the call the morning of the 4th to tell them their daughter was missing. How can you find the lawsuit? Just look up Camp Mystic lawsuit. The refund checks that my friend's family received included the name of their daughter on the memo line with a heart at the end. No personal note. My refund check, this is the friend, nearly $5,000 for the 2-week term. So yeah, it was close to $10,000. Included a professionally printed card with a sketch of a cross on one side and a Bible verse on the other. Thick paper, soft matte finish, rounded corners. They had time to design, order, and receive those cards, but not any time to write a note to the families of the deceased. And that to me is where the rubber meets the road. And you might say, well, they were worried they were going to get sued. Well, you know what? They were going to get sued anyway. At some point, you can do the right thing. And you might get sued, but people will be like, well, they did the right thing. At least now they're admitting it. Because what's going to happen is this is going to go to a jury. And I'm not a betting type, but I would feel safe betting that any jury that reads the evacuation plan that says all cabins are on high spaces and tries to tell a counselor's parent that the camp didn't do anything wrong, they're sorely mistaken. My friend's daughter, surviving counselor, tells of Edward Eastland standing in ankle-deep water inside the twins' cabin and telling the counselor and girls to stay put while the counselor pleaded for them to evacuate. An hour later, half the girls had washed away. Clark Baker, Mary Grace's father, she died in the flood. My daughter should still be here. Her death was 100% preventable. This was an act of pure complacency. It was 100% preventable failure. It's a failure of planning, prevention, detection, and response. Our daughters paid an ultimate price for their obedience to a plan that was destined to fail. All cabins are constructed on high, safe locations. Camp Mystic and these faithful alumni call the flood an unimaginable accident. But as we can see in the lawsuits, the parents aren't saying this was an unimaginable accident. And when the lawsuit was filed, the Eastland family, this was their response. We continue to pray for the grieving families and ask for God's healing and comfort. Are they praying for their healing? Like, at what point are did they just say, I'm sorry? We're so sorry. We're sorry. We are sorry. These people aren't in it to money. These people are already wealthy. And again, here's the flood plan. Those on the flats must stay in their cabins unless told otherwise by the office. I mean, a month ago, Tweety Eastland, they sent out an email and it said, "We look forward to welcoming you back inside the green gates." Is anybody nuts enough to think that the Eastlands are able to navigate safely the running of a camp? Even if you love them, do you think that they are good at safety measures? You couldn't say yes. So in the lawsuit, it says, well, one, at 1:14 a.m., the flood warning with considerable, quote, and life-threatening tags was issued at 1:14 a.m. Now, evacuations didn't start until 2 to 2:30, and I'd say probably closer to 2:30. Jeff Carr, who was the spokesman for the family, said this in the very beginning, which is interesting. It would have been impossible for Dick not to have gotten that alert. Or he said it would have been impossible for him not to get that alert. Family members said it woke him up. He got that alarm. He went out onto the property to assess. He called the rest of the family on walkie-talkies. He was actively assessing conditions across the camp, and things sort of ensued from there. At that point, why wouldn't the policy have been, we're going to evacuate cabins in the flats when we get a flash flood warning? That's all they had to do. All they had to do. There were right many adults there. Tweety could have gotten her hair wet. Maybe Mary Liz did, maybe some of these people who were not drowning as children were drowning could have been helping. For the life of me, I live on the water. I cannot imagine sitting here right now while children were drowning down there. It wouldn't happen. They thought they were safer in the cabin. Well, Laura, it's interesting that you say that. So Dick Eastland knew that they weren't safer in the cabin. And the way I know that he knew that is because he was on the Guadalupe River Authority Board for years. Very good organization, very aware of flooding and what that means to be in a flood. So this is interesting. In 2017, a video was made called Be Flood Aware by the Upper Guadalupe River Authority. It said the terrain here is known for flash flooding, and if it rains above the Guadalupe River, you can get massive walls of water. 3 to 4 inches of rain at one time can be a real problem. They called it Flash Flood Alley. This is in a video in 2017. Listen to this. Never drive through floodwaters. 1 foot deep will float your vehicle. 2 feet of rushing water will turn over an SUV. 6 inches of flowing water will knock you off your feet. Staying put is the best advice if you don't heed the warnings. You need to accept the consequences. Now, Jeff Carr said they had no information that indicated the magnitude of what was coming. Is that true? Be flood aware. They got the warning. When Ainsley, I think it was Ainsley, a counselor at Gigglebox, looked out the window, they saw a vehicle with water over the tires with people in it. So if you're on a board and you've put out a video and it says 2 feet of water will turn over an SUV, why would you pile an entire cabin into your vehicle? Staying put is the best advice if you don't heed the warnings. You need to accept the consequences. In 1990, Dick Eastland said to the Austin American Statesman paper, "I'm sure there will be other drownings. People don't heed the warnings." So in Wiggle In, you have Glenn, who's the night watchman. He stayed with the girls. They floated on mattresses. Bubble In, Dick put all those girls in the car, and they drowned. At Twins, Edward told them to stay put. Half got out, half died. Gigglebox, Ainsley, the counselors were able to get those girls out. Chatterbox, the counselors got the children out of the windows, moved up the hill. Bug House, Laney Owens was the first that went to the Eastlands and said, "There's water in the cabin." And they said, "Going back to your cabin." And then they got out too. Okay, so let's get back to this timeline because I think this is really important. So at 1:14, Dick gets the warning. We know Dick gets the warning because Jeff Carr, the spokesman for the family, says it would have been impossible for him not to get that alert. Family members said it woke him up. He got that alarm. 1:14 a.m. From 1:45 to 2:13, camp leaders Richard and Edward Eastland worked to move equipment at the camp. So really what the flood plan should have said is, in case of a flood warning, move canoes. Because that's what they did. If this was an unimaginable accident, if they had no idea what was going to happen, why did they move the effing canoes? Because they knew something was happening. You know, if Mary or myself, if I smell smoke and I think, well, you know what? I'm going to get out my jewelry. There's smoke. You save the people, whether it's a flood or a fire or a tornado, you always save the people. I just don't get it. I do not get it. At 2:20 a.m., counselors reported water entering in their cabins, but they were instructed to remain inside. That would be Laney Owens from Bug House. Went up, but at 2:30 a.m., 10 minutes later, 5 cabins were evacuated, the ones closest to the river. The ones with the younger children weren't as close to the river, but they were still in the flat area. So if you think about a football field, it's flat, right? And there's a tsunami coming. And you're at the faraway end zone and you're at the near end zone. Well, you might want to get the people out of the first end zone out first. But if you had a couple sets of staircases, in this case they were outside, wouldn't you have just said, well, there's a tsunami coming, everybody get the hell out of here? 2:20 to 2:30, they evacuate 5 cabins. At 3:35, Dick Eastland's SUV was swept away. 13 campers, 2 counselors. 3:35. From 3:35 to 4:09, 11 campers died in the twins' cabin because they were told to stay there because the water would go back down. All cabins are constructed on high, safe locations. But in 2011, 2013, 2019, and 2020, The Eastland family successfully appealed to FEMA to remove Camp Mystic from the special flood hazard area. The lawsuit kind of talks about the history of flooding, and then it really diagrams exactly where the areas were. And one thing that's kind of interesting is that Bubble Inn and Twins 1 and 2 are at this confluence of the Guadalupe and two major tributaries. And so I don't know if you can see that, but the arrows are pointing there. And so right where it's pointing, that's where, you know, there was this huge surge of water. And this was not an unusual, this was known that would be a dangerous place where these cabins were built. 11,000 acres of watershed would be there. I mean, 6 years ago, new cabins were constructed in this area. This was not a long time ago. Some of them were in the highest risk location for flooding as identified by FEMA. So they got the warning, flash flood warning is going to happen. Even though many campers escaped to higher ground, defendants instructed that the youngest campers in Bubble Inn and Twins 1 and 2 be kept in the cabins, although water was rapidly rising within the cabins. There were multiple ways plaintiffs' daughters could have been evacuated to escape the floodwaters. Within only 20 yards from the Bubble Inn door was a hill. 20 yards. Camp Mystic staff, just yards away from the youngest campers in Bubble Inn and Twins 1 and 2, remained in their residence above the commissary building and survived. 20 yards away, there were adults that lived. So you can see this cabin, and then the dark is the hill. So 1:14 a.m. This is directly from the lawsuit, which I think is interesting. Dick Eastland is the only owner of the camp that died. Edward, I think, was found in a tree with some girls. So July 3rd, on July 2nd, there was a emergency meeting about the flooding that was going to happen. This is July 2nd. Texas Department of Emergency Management they activate a state of emergency. So I live in North Carolina, and if a state of emergency is called, it's a big deal. You know, it's the kind of thing that shows up on the news, like it's a big deal. July 3rd, judges and mayors were told about these weather threats. There was a flood hazard outlook. At 10:50 in the morning, the National Weather Service issued a flood watch. At 2:35, it went out everywhere. At 6:10, the National Weather Service issued an assessment for flash flooding. July 3rd at 11:13 at night. So this would have been the night before. Flood advisory is posted for Carr County. Significant flooding likely. National Weather Service. This is at 11:15 p.m. July 4th, despite the rain and early weather advisories, several counselors and workers left Camp Mystic for their night off. Several counselors have indicated that counselors and workers began returning starting about 12:40 a.m. 1:14 a.m., Dick Eastland and other CAP staff received the National Weather Service flash flooding alert. Edward Eastland said that Dick had this home weather station, and Glenn also got the warning, the kind of night guard. At 1:47 a.m., Dick and Edward Eastland met with the Camp Mystics ground crew. So this is 30 minutes after the warning, and began securing equipment around the property. At 2 a.m., campers were identifying the intensity of the storm, woke them up from their sleep. Edward Eastland tried to send Glenn home, the night watchman, but Glenn said, well, I can't go home. The water is high. And Glenn ended up in a cabin and, stayed through the storm with the little girls. At 2:10 a.m., the counselors from Bug House arrived at the office and said the cabins are flooding. They were told, return to your cabins and shelter in place. No cabin had a weather radio or a walkie-talkie. No phones. At 2:13 a.m., Edward and Dick Eastland are still securing equipment at the camp. 2:13 a.m. Children are sheltering in place. So when this happened, the first thing we heard was, it came up so fast, 30 feet of water in 9 seconds. This is fast, but not fast. This is 1:14 a.m. It's now 2:13 a.m. It's an hour. It's been an hour. An hour to walk 20 yards. At 2:19 a.m., no, 2:10 a.m., counselors from Bug House say there's water coming in. At 2:19, Camp Mystic staff became aware that the Bug House cabin was also taking on water. I think at 2:10 a.m., it just looked like it was going to, and water was coming in the side. According to Edward Eastland, he, Dick, and other counselors drove to Bug House to check. Edward confirmed water was entering the cabin, but instructed the counselors to put towels down at the base of the doorway and stay in the cabin. This is at the same Edward Eastland who is looking forward to welcoming campers to the gates this summer of Camp Mystic. And you're going to tell me you're good, you feel good about Edward Eastland. And Mary Liz and Tweety, who were not down here with children. The adults that did the most to save children were the counselors and Glenn, the night watchman. At 2:25 a.m., for some reason, the gatekeeper, Frances Blackwell, calls him via this handheld radio. She's got one. And she says the gatehouse is taking on water. He tells her to get out of the gatehouse. Edward Eastland said at that point, he knew the situation was very serious. That was 2:25 a.m. At 2:30 a.m., they had begun evacuating. Glenn said he did not feel it was safe to use a vehicle to rescue children. Several counselors recall him driving to their cabin and asking if it was flooded. Despite the fact that the cabins were flooding, he told them to stay in their cabin. And that's kind of interesting because I think Glenn is kind of trying to remove himself from telling that. I think he was told to tell that. It's like this question of, you're an adult and then another adult gives you bad advice. So if I'm say my son's soccer team is playing and an adult like a coach says, we're not leaving the field, we're going to stay in lightning. You know, does the assistant coach, does a parent, does somebody say, forget you, we're not staying out here? At 3 a.m., counselors in some cabins were awakened by the storm. They began the process of waking up their campers and exiting with them to the hillside to the east of cabins. At 3:11 a.m., Camp Mystics counselors in higher elevations provided several accounts. This is when they started to wake up. At 3:26 a.m., there are timestamped photos when the camp was flooding, but the campers were still able to walk to safer, higher ground. At 3:26 a.m. This was at 3:26 a.m. Two hours and 12 minutes after that, 3:26 a.m. And this is when it's really going fast. 3:44 a.m., cabin doors are breaking open and water is rushing in. Now, Edward says he realized it was serious at 2:25 a.m. At 3:26 a.m., the children were still able to walk. At 3:51 a.m., Dick Eastland's Apple Watch is submerged in water. At 4:09 a.m., Edward Eastland's Apple Watch was submerged in water. At 9:44 a.m., Mary Liz Eastland stated they were still searching for girls. What cabin did the girls come from in that picture? They came from, let me look. I believe that was Gigglebox. I believe that was Gigglebox. As the water rose within Bubble Inn and Twins 1 and 2 cabins, terrified girls began climbing up the top bunk beds or treading water to try to keep their heads above water. The water rose so close to the ceiling, 5 inches, the girls ran out of airspace and were tragically swept into the floodwaters. Lucy Dillon did not make it out of the cabin where she lost her life. Five inches. They couldn't breathe in there. They couldn't breathe. I think I just don't even know how there's a question of if anybody was at fault. The more we find out, the more horrifying the negligence is. And you might say, well, they couldn't have known. I just don't even know. Nobody can say that now. I mean, it's like you're telling me, you know, or it's like me telling you, well, I didn't know the fire would get big. These cabins didn't have rafters. I guess another camp did. Dick Eastland knew better. And if they didn't know better, it was by choice. You know, they chose not to get accredited by the ACA. They chose to fight FEMA on the flood zone information. Yeah, there is a GoFundMe. There has been a GoFundMe for Dick Eastland. Let me see if it's still up. They're people that love the Eastlands are doing, having a picture, an artist doing a picture of him, a painting of him, for Tweety for Christmas. Oh yeah, here it is. Dick Eastland memorial gift. I mean, this really takes the cake. A memorial gift for Tweety and the Eastland family for Christmas. This Christmas, we want to come together as Camp Mystic alumni to give a gift that will last a lifetime. Many of us have been deeply moved by the legacy of Dick Eastland. Is my eye twitching? His kindness, his laughter, and his enduring love for Camp Mystic. His sudden passing in the floods left the Eastland family with an immeasurable loss, and our hearts have ached to do something truly meaningful for Tweety and her family. Over the past few months, I have personally collected more than 100 alumni handwritten letters to Tweety. How many handwritten letters has Tweety written to anybody? Not one family has gotten a handwritten letter from Tweety. They got a refund check with their dead child's name in the memo line. No note. Here's your $8,000 back. Good luck. Please share this with Mystic alumni, and please do not share on social media. We are desperately trying to keep this a surprise. Well, not a surprise anymore. We are commissioning an extraordinary artist and dear friend, Jamie Wells, to create a large and refined painting. Jamie will layer the letters and meaningful memorabilia into a flat lay style composition, cover it with resin for a glass-like finish, and then paint a detailed portrait of Dick and Tweety over the top. The result will be a striking 48 to 60-inch painting that combines our words, our memories, and Jamie's artistry into a single timeless tribute. A piece Tweety can hang in her home forever, where Dick's smiling face and the legacy of his love for people, especially campers and counselors, will be remembered for generations. Oh, the deadline was October 18th. But on October 27th, the organizer, Jenny, said, "Hi, just wanted to keep you all in the loop. The deposit has been made for the painting, estimated delivery date second weekend of December. Excited to see the end results. I cannot thank you enough for making all of this happen." Seriously? the word tone deaf, I feel like there should be like a shirt made. They got the money back in no note. They just wrote the dead children's names in the memo line on the check. But now we're going to give Tweety a $9,000 painting. What? You can love Tweety. You can say Tweety didn't want those children to drown. But you can also say, these people were idiots. These people smelled smoke and they went back to bed. They said, there's no fire. There's no problems. I mean, give me an effing break. These poor families. Yeah, if you want to do something for somebody, do something for the families of the children that died. Right? Ah, yeah. And let me tell you something. If you're watching this video, you're not making a comment now. Don't go sending me an email or a message and then go crazy when I share that you sent me a message and what your name is. Don't send me a message. I don't want an Instagram message. I don't want nothing about you whining that everybody at Camp Mystic is wonderful. I don't disagree that these people weren't wonderful. But do I think they should be lauded? No, I don't. No, I do not. No, I don't. I mean, so many messages. So many messages. My daughter was one of the 27 girls that died at Mystic. Thank you for speaking out. I have so much I want to say, but I don't even know how to say it right now. But thank you. I'm suffering beyond comprehension because of what I saw and heard during those horrific days. The Mystic alums are just adding to the trauma, as it is clear the camp is more important than my daughter's life to them. It's really so hurtful, as my daughter was amazing. It also hurts that Mystic won't even say her name. It's like she was just a little speed bump in their year. Wow. Mm-mm-mm-mm-mm-mm. My guess is that the Eastlands are probably going to settle. My hope is that the camp does not reopen unless there are people that are actually professionals in charge of doing something like that. But I doubt that the Eastlands want to give up that power or that money. This is not a nonprofit camp. This is a for-profit camp. And the whole family is making a living from this camp. Of course they want the camp open. Is it safe? hard time agreeing to a settlement. Yeah, it's not about money. It's not about money. And honestly, and I'm no PR person, I just play one on TV. I think if the Eastlands had done the right thing to begin with and just admitted their fault of the matter, we wouldn't be having this conversation. Because the conversation would now be, they said they were inept. They did all these things wrong. Like, there's nothing else to say when somebody just admits, I did it. That's the problem. But thanks for tuning in. See my members, subscribers tomorrow morning for coffee. And look forward to it. Lots of love to those families.